and people couldn't figure out what was going on. And then they started to notice a lot of them bunched together around lunchtime. And what had happened was the people at the observatory would heat up their lunch in the microwave. And something they would do is they would open the door of the microwave oven before the microwave stopped. This is bad for your microwave oven. It wears it out. But not only that, it produced a burst of radio signal that was picked up by these sensitive detectors. So this, I think, is an interesting lesson. Some events end up being something unusual and conventional, but some events with these FRBs turn out to be these powerful explosions which are taking place at cosmological distances. Their nature's still not fully understood. I think they're one of the really most fascinating objects we have, these bursts going out all over space. They're interesting probes because they're kind of lighting up space between here and there. And they're a subject of very active research. And if one looks at the history of these FRBs, at first they were discovered, not believed, then finally confirmed, and they were discovered by instruments that were very sensitive but not optimized for this. And now what we're doing is we're optimizing instruments and optimizing software to look for these events. And it's often these surprises that turn out to be most interesting. And there are phenomena like sprites, which you can think of as upward-going lightning, which were seen by commercial pilots and somewhat not believed, right? Because they were very strange. And it was really only when we were able to take very high-speed imaging data, data taken often from places like space station, that we were able to see that and learn about these fascinating ionospheric phenomena. So it's surprises are really interesting. I mean, I think this is one of the fascinating things about the UAP phenomenon. If it's something that's anomalous, that makes it interesting and worthy of study. Other questions? Great. So now let me turn over to Sean.
Thank you, David, Dan. It's a pleasure to be back. Good morning, everyone. I want to start by thanking NASA for convening today's UAP Independent Study public meeting and inviting me to continue to participate. NASA has been an invaluable partner to our team at AARO as we work to better understand and respond to unidentified anomalous phenomena. We applaud NASA for commissioning its independent study team and for exploring what data and tools could be leveraged to shed greater light on UAP. Though NASA and AARO are taking on very different aspects of the UAP problem set, our efforts are very much complementary. We both are committed to the scientific method, to a data-driven approach, and the highest standards of scientific research integrity. While NASA is evaluating unclassified data sources for its study, AARO's data set includes classified material with a focus on national security areas. However, all of this data collectively is critical to understanding the nature and origin of UAP. NASA brings unique capabilities, world-class scientists, and a wealth of academic and research linkages. NASA also has access to Earth sensing satellites, radiological sensors, tools for gravitational wave, geomagnetic wave detection, and means for analyzing open source and crowdsourced data that may assist both AARO and NASA in their UAP efforts. We are very grateful for the partnership and welcome the opportunity to join with NASA to share our collective findings with the public as the U.S. government moves towards greater transparency on this issue. Last month, I testified before members of the Senate Armed Services Committee on emerging threats and capabilities and shared some of the progress made since AARO's establishment in July 2022. I discussed AARO's scientific and analytic approaches its efforts to improve UAP data collection, standardize our reporting processes, leverage our partnerships, and meticulously review the U.S. government's UAP-related historical records. As I told the subcommittee then, the resolution of all UAP cases cannot be accomplished by DoD and the intelligence community alone. AARO's ultimate success will require partnerships with the interagency, industry, academia, the scientific community, and the public, which all bring their own resources, ideas, and expertise to the UAP challenge. We believe robust collaboration and peer review across a broad range of partners will promote greater objectivity and transparency in the study of UAP. Of course, NASA's UAP independent study team was convened very much in that spirit. I also emphasized to Congress that only a very small percentage of UAP reports display signatures that could reasonably be described as anomalous. The majority of unidentified objects reported to AARO and in our holdings demonstrate mundane characteristics of readily explainable sources. While a large number of cases in AARO's holdings remain technically unresolved, this is primarily due to a lack of data associated with those cases, very much along the lines of what David was just speaking about. Without sufficient data, we are unable to reach defendable conclusions that meet the high scientific standards we set for resolution. Meanwhile, for the few objects that do demonstrate potentially anomalous characteristics, AARO is approaching these cases with the highest level of objectivity and analytic rigor. This includes physical testing and employing modeling and simulation to validate our analyses and the underlying theories, and then peer reviewing those results before reaching any conclusions. AARO has shared these cases with the appropriately cleared NASA team members in order to discuss and help recommend potential scientific areas of study that NASA may want to take lead on. I'll underscore here, as I did before Congress, that AARO's work will take time if we are committed to doing it right. AARO is committed to the highest standards of scientific research integrity, as we know our partners at NASA are as well. Thanks again to NASA for hosting this public forum for UAP discussion and information exchange. And I'd like to turn to a brief presentation that includes some recently declassified footage and trends for discussion. Next slide, please. So some of you probably saw a version of this at the open hearing last month. This is an overall review of all of the analytic trends of all the cases that we have to date. While the numbers may have changed a little bit, the overall trends remain the same. Most of what we are seeing reported by aircraft are at the altitudes where we fly aircraft. That should not be a surprise. You will note, however, that I have no space reports and I have no maritime reports. That is notable, even though we are looking across all of those domains. On the upper right, we have UAP morphologies. The vast majority of what has been reported and what we have data on, a little less than half now, are orbs, round spheres. And in the bottom right, you will see in the heat map of the areas where we get most of our reporting. This is very much a collection-biased map. This is where our sensors are, our military, NRIC, and some of the FAA data. In the middle, it is what we call our typical UAP characteristics for the vast majority of the cases that we see. One way of looking at that is we'll call it a target package. This is the thing we are out hunting for in most cases. Next slide, please. This is an example of one that I showed at the hearing recently. This is a spherical orb, metallic, in the Middle East, 2022, by an MQ-9. I will come back to the sensor question that David raised here in a moment. This is a typical example of the thing that we see most of. We see these all over the world, and we see these in making very interesting apparent maneuvers. This one in particular, however, I would point out, demonstrated no enigmatic technical capabilities, and was no threat to airborne safety. While we are still looking at it, I don't have any more data other than that. And so being able to come to some conclusion is going to take time until we can get better resolved data on similar objects that we can then do a larger analysis on. Next slide, please. I'm going to let this play through. This is a newly released video. You'll notice there are two dots moving back and forth. There is a plane at the bottom that's moving across the screen, and now there are three dots moving back and forth. The moving back and forth is from the sensor and the platform that's collecting it. This is a P3 on a training mission in the Western United States. They picked these up and they tried to intercept and was unable to intercept them. Apart from that motion, and you'll see a little bit of defocusing from the sensor itself, there is no other oddity about this, except for the fact that they couldn't catch them. The reason they couldn't catch them is because after further analysis, it was shown that those objects were actually much farther away from the P3 than they thought. And in fact, when we went even deeper, looked at air traffic control data, we were able to match those to aircraft on a major flight corridor heading into a major airport for landing. This is the kind of thing that can spoof and or provide misperception of both very highly trained pilots as well as sensors, right? And this was reported as an odd grouping of 3 UAP. All right. That is not to say that the pilots didn't know what they were looking at, or they knew what they were looking at, but they weren't really sure. But it also is they're not sure, they're reporting it now, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. And then we have to go look at it. Next slide, please. That brings us to really what is AARO doing in the science and technical realm. So this is one of those areas that I'm going to expound a little bit more on than we did in the last hearings. AARO has a robust scientific plan that we are required to then provide to Congress here pretty soon. One of the first things that we're doing is looking across all the existing sensor data against that typical UAP target that I gave you up at the very first slide. That goes beyond DoD and IC sensors. That's commercial, that's civil, that's and with partnership with NASA sensors and NOAA sensors. Understanding if any of these Earth sensing satellites, any of these airborne platforms, any of these ground radars, whether it's FAA or other, can actually see these things, given what we've got so far, is going to be an important first step to understanding which sensors are going to be relevant. From there, we are augmenting with dedicated sensors that we've purpose-built, designed to detect, track, and characterize those particular objects. We will be then putting those out in very select areas for surveillance purposes. Partnerships with academia, exploring the signatures to match to our data. So understanding if a thing is moving and if it is doing certain anomalous activities, what are the signatures we would expect to see? How do we pull on that? And then from there, how do I tune my collection architecture to go after it? Statistical analytic techniques. We're working with a couple of universities on how do I do broader-based statistical analysis on unclassified and classified data so that I can apply those analytics to our holdings. And then AI and ML analytic techniques for searching out through the data what are the objects, what are the targets that we're going after. We have partnerships with both DoD and DOE labs to explore our current state-of-the-art fundamental physics of UAP observations, both current and historical. In other words, if I have objects, those few that are doing some things that are anomalous, what is our current understanding of maneuverability, speed, signature management, propulsion? What are those underlying signatures that we would expect to see, and how do I then pull on that? our interagency and allied partnerships for calibration of our capabilities. This is exactly what David was pointing at. A vast majority of what we have reported to us are DoD sensors. DoD sensors are not scientific sensors. They are not intelligence community sensors. Believe it or not, intelligence community sensors are very close to scientific sensors. They are calibrated, they are high precision, they are everything you'd ever want to know about a thing. DoD sensors have one purpose. They are to identify an object that is known and put a weapon on it. That is what they're for, right, predominantly. So understanding how do you calibrate those against these known objects? How do I fly an F-35 against a weather balloon at different speeds and different altitudes and different sun conditions and different lighting conditions and heating conditions? Those are all important measurements that need to be done, and we are in process of doing that right now. That table on the right is a very simplified version of our entire test matrix, which you would not be able to fit on 3 of these slides against all of our sensors across all of those phenomenologies. That will be useful in order to then train our operators, pilots, and sensors against the known objects. And then finally, our pattern of life analysis. This is essentially baselining what is normal. I have all these hotspot areas, but we only have hotspot areas because that's when the reports come in from the operators that are operating at that time. They don't operate all the time. So to have a 24/7 collection monitoring campaign in some of these areas for 3 months at a time is going to be necessary in order to measure out what is normal. Then I'll know what is not normal, right, when we have additional things that come through those spaces. And that includes space and maritime. Next slide, please. Which brings me to some of my recommendations for the panel and their consideration and deliberation. Some of these we're going to be exploring with our new NASA embed, whom I'm happy to be welcoming on pretty soon, who's going to help us in our scientific plan. Crowdsourcing unclassified open source data. This is where some of the public can be helpful. Imagery from an iPhone is generally not helpful unless you are right up on whatever it is you're looking at. However, some of the ancillary data that your iPhone provides, from location to speed to other phenomenologies, and more than one of those can be very helpful. Right? Large-scale, ground-based scientific instrumentation. Evaluating how can I use some of these other instruments for detection. The FRB example was perfect, right? You have a bunch of large-scale instruments that were not designed for that, yet they picked them up because there was a microwave. Well, we have a surrogate target package of what we think these things are, at least from what we've got reported to us. That was in the front slide. Understanding how can I evaluate that against all of these other instruments, and do any of them have a chance of picking anything up that would be helpful in tipping and cueing us to get other sensors on target. I think leading that evaluation of the scientific ground-based sensors would be useful. Also, the same thing for the Earth Sciences satellites, as we mentioned before. Intentional vice coincidental collection. So looking at how can I provide a tip and cue to both the ground and space-based scientific and academic sensor community to put additional sensors on an object when it is reported. I'm currently doing that with AARO, the Joint Staff, the commands for when they get tip and cue, right? So a pilot says something, they see something, they report it in, and we're going to turn on a whole bunch of new collection to go after it. I should be able to hand that same tip and cue to the scientific and academic community. So looking at how that works would be helpful. Peer reviewing advanced capabilities, the parameterization and the publication of that have not yet been engineered. We understand a lot of fundamental physics, it is the scientific community's responsibility to explore and document those fundamentals in peer-reviewed scientific journals to match to data so that we can weed out all kinds of different hypotheses, right? That's how science works. We need to make sure that we are doing that. I think leading that conversation would be very helpful from NASA's perspective. Archived scientific data. So we have a whole bunch of calibrated, large-scale scientific data from all these different instrumentations around the world. Taking a look at how can you apply maybe some AI, ML tools to search through that data for anomalous signatures that may correlate to things that we've got reporting on. That would be an interesting study. Distributions of sightings. I think this is a low-hanging fruit one, right? So if we take a look at all of the distributions of sightings that are outside of my national security areas that I've got classified reporting for, and they generate the similar distribution map as we've got, and we put those two pieces together, now I have a holistic picture. And then, of course, our foreign partnerships, building a robust scientific community of interest, review data, capabilities, conduct analysis, expanding upon our military and intelligence collaborations across the world into the scientific and academic world. And with that, those were my thoughts. We've talked about some of these in the past. It would be interesting to hear if there's any further questions or deliberations on any of those points, and I'm happy to take any questions that you all have.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kirkpatrick. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank you and the AARO for your openness in providing this committee with insight and information about what you've learned so far, how we could work together. I think this is very much an area where it's going to be essential that NASA be a partner and be a good partner for AARO. And I think you're really want to thank you for your role with this committee in helping to start to build that partnership.
It's been my pleasure.
And let's, Reggie.
Yeah. Hey, Sean, thanks for the briefing. Question. We talked a lot about data already. Let's talk about sensors for a second. So you mentioned that you work with labs, academia. Do you see a need to go beyond what you mentioned earlier? That is the type of sensors we have right now, which are based on national security threats and certain phenomenologies and frequency range of these kinds of things. Do you see a reason of going beyond that?
Yep,
And
absolutely.
So what are some of the challenges you see there, materials or what have you?
So can we go back to the front slide, just the first slide where the target characterization is? So we've purpose-built a couple of sensors to do search across that, nope, down one, there you go, that's great. To go down some of those characteristics to see if we can find them correlated to pilot reporting. Right. Some of those are, initially this is going to be, I'm going to say this is a bootstrap method, right? We're doing a broad spectrum search across very few indicators that we can point to that will enable us to get a little bit more data, refine that, narrow those sensors and go from there. So we aren't just relying on the DoD and IC sensors that exist today because frankly they don't point to where we want them to point, right? I mean, I'll be frank with everyone. We can point the largest collection apparatus in the entire globe at any point we want. You just have to tell me where I want to point it. Second piece of that is a lot of what we have is around the continental United States. Most people, including the government, don't like it when I point our entire collection apparatus to your backyard, right? It's not allowed. We have some laws about that, and we've got to figure out how to do this only in the areas that I can get high confidence there's going to be something there, and high confidence I'm not going to break any laws doing it. Right? So there's a trade there. So some of these ground-based point detectors are going to be necessary for that, to point up, to point out, to search. Coupled with, we're evaluating a number of sensor opportunities across different organizations, academia, industry, whatnot, that already exist or are being built for similar purposes or maybe other purposes that I might be able to recalibrate for this and see if those will have a chance of seeing that target, right? So that's where the modeling and sim comes in. Can I take that target, put it into your sensor, and have a chance of seeing it? If I can, then I might want to use that. Right. Oh, wait.
Who's next?
Are you?
Nadia.
Go.
Hi. Thanks, Sean. I have the questions you probably don't want, which are about numbers, unless I missed them during your presentation. You had said that only a very small percentage of your cases display signatures that could be anomalous, and then followed that up with the few objects that do demonstrate potentially anomalous characteristics. What numbers are we talking about? How big is your database? How many years was it collected over, and were those observations made? And then by few, what do you mean?
Right. No, that's a great question. So this chart, as I mentioned, we've updated with our current data holdings. At the time of my open hearing, we were at 650 cases-ish. We are now over 800. We are putting together our annual report, which will be due August 1 to the Hill. And in it, and there will be an unclassified version, as there always has been, we will have those updated numbers at that time. We roughly get, I mean, you can do the math, you know, it depends anywhere from 50 to 100-ish new reports a month. Now, the reason we had such a big jump recently is because I got FAA's data integrated in finally, and so we ended up with like 100 and some odd new cases. So there's reason why it's going to fluctuate. The numbers that I would say, so we're gonna try to do a little more fidelity on some of the analytics when we report out. But the numbers I would say that we see are possibly really anomalous are less than single-digit percentages of that total database. So maybe 2 to 5-ish%. Wait.
Who's next? Who's
Is
next?
this on? Hi.
All right.
I'll stand up because
I'm
I'm
gonna
on
get
the
to
other end of the room. Thanks, Sean, for your presentation and for some of the video footage that we saw. While we're all good scientists on this panel, I think that I look at it with an untrained eye of looking at that video. And so I see 3 spots moving, and everything else in the background looks like it's stable. Can you talk a little bit more about either the sensor platform or what we're seeing that's stable in the background? Because they've been identified as airplanes, and there's clear description of from other data sources that came in to help clarify that. But when I look at this, what are all of the white spots in the background that we're seeing that are stable?
So those are that's a star background. Pretty sure that's a star background. Now, so you're looking at those planes were roughly 30 to 40-ish miles away, if I remember correctly. And when you see that smaller plane that comes in at the bottom, that one was much, much closer. It was like maybe 6 to 10 miles away, right? And so the jitter in the sensor is what you're looking at.
Right, okay, so the 3 spots, because they look like they're moving at about the same,
Right, they are.
right? And if they were flying together, but they're not, is what I'm hearing. This is the sensor moving.
They're in a flight line,
Right,
so they're equally spaced in a flight line, and the sensor is jittering.
thank you,
Yes,
appreciate that.
yes. Wait,
next?
Walter's been
Yeah,
waiting.
patiently waiting. Okay, if you go to your first slide, if you don't mind, not the title slide, but the one
trends
you had,
slide,
the trends,
please.
yeah. It's the previous slide.
There you go. Thank you.
So I want to make sure I understand the slide. It says typically reported characteristics, and there are a bunch of things here, like, for example, size, altitude, speed. If it's being observed from a single sensor, use the example of like the airplanes that were coming in, and if you don't know how far away they are, how do you assess the size?
Correct.
How do you assess the speed? This is what people would report, but it isn't necessarily,
What
for
is
example,
real.
the size of the object or the speed or any of the rest of it. Do I understand that correctly?
Partially.
Okay.
So this is not all single sensor observations. Some of these are very much multi-sensor observations.
Okay.
And this is parameterized to cover the range of things for any given parameter, the range of what's possible and what is been observed.
Okay, and then on the next slide, the one where you've got the,
Orb.
whatever it is, the meatball moving across the screen.
Right, that one.
So was there any look at sensor artifact, data processing artifact? I mean, the first thing that, whenever I see anything that's anomalous, I look at how was the data collected.
Yeah. So yes, these are so this is an EO sensor on an MQ-9, and we understand that very, very well. And so that is a real object, absolutely. Anna Marie.
You mentioned that in the partnership with academia, you also use AI ML techniques for existing data sets, possibly some of them open source. Can you explain a little bit more what kind of AI ML techniques you're using? Are these about anomaly detection? Are you using anything related to natural language processing? Are you using anything related to computer vision?
Right. So we're looking at a number of different capabilities that span, I think, a lot of what you've just said. So we've got, we haven't applied it yet. We are researching how we're going to apply it. So natural language processing for the reports from pilots, absolutely. All right. Target recognition, so I can train a model to look for that thing and go back through all of our holdings and go, give me how many of these you have, right? And then try to figure out what those are. Right? So I have not put anything out there yet, or have not looked at anything yet for active targeting in real time, because I don't know exactly what I would train it to go look for. I just know what we have. So I want to get more confidence on what we have before I go and do that, except for balloons, right? We're trying to get rid of balloons as quickly as possible.
So, Sean, I just wanted to begin by thanking you for your service to this nation, this committee. You don't exactly have the easiest job in Washington. So
No, I do not.
appreciate it.
I'm glad you recognize that.
Yes, we certainly do. I also want to commend you noting the international partnerships. Spain just signed the Artemis Accords yesterday, increasing the membership to 25. I think that's a global partnership that you could leverage. Only 170 more countries to go, NASA, before we have everyone signed up. I just have two questions. One, relative to what Nadia was asking you about the number of anomalous phenomena. What makes it anomalous in your view? What is the phenomenology where you're pulling those cases out and saying this is truly unexplained? And then my second question would be relative to the stigma. How damaging is that in your view? And what in particular do you think NASA can do to help remedy the situation?
Those are great questions. I'm going to take the second one first, because I know we're getting short on time. The stigma has improved significantly over the years since the Navy first took this on some years ago. It is not gone, and in fact, I would argue the stigma exists inside the leadership of all of our buildings, right, wherever that is. My team and I have also been subject to lots of harassment, especially coming out of my last hearing, because people don't understand the scientific method and why we have to do the things we have to do, right? And because we can't just come out and say, you know, the greatest thing that could happen to me is I could come out and say, hey, I know where all these things are. Here you go, right? But I don't, right? And it's going to take us time to research all that. People want answers now, and so they're actually feeding the stigma by exhibiting that kind of behavior to all of us, right? That is a bad thing. Where can NASA help? I made that recommendation on NASA should lead the scientific discourse. We need to elevate this conversation. Right? We need to have this conversation in an open environment like this where we aren't going to get harassed. Because this is a hard problem. It is a hard target problem. We need to understand what is the things that are in all of our domains, space or air or undersea, and how do we make sense of that? Right. Your first question on what makes it anomalous to me, we actually developed some definitions on all of these things. We gave it both to the White House and to Congress. I think we've got some of that into law now, but essentially anomalous is anything that is not readily understandable by the operator or the sensor. Right? So it is doing something weird, whether that's maneuvering against the wind at Mach 2 with no apparent propulsion, or it's going into the water, which we have shown is not the case. That is actually a sensor anomaly that we've now figured out, and we're going to be publishing all of that. You know, those kinds of things make anomalous. Signature, we'll call it signature management, but it's things that are not readily understandable in the context of, hey, I've got a thing that's out in the light. It should reflect a certain amount of light. If it doesn't reflect that amount of light, something weird.
I think we have time for one last question.
Sean, you recommended foreign partnership with NASA. I'm curious, especially given your map, have you, as AARO, partnered with international agencies, and is there ways for reporting to your?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. I want to expound on that just a little bit. So I have just held our first Five Eyes forum on this subject last week, I think it was, or earlier this week. I don't know. Dan was there, and we have, we've entered into discussions with our partners on data sharing. How do they do reporting? What kind of analysis can they help us with? What kind of calibration can they help us with? What can we help them with? And we're establishing all of that right now. And they're going to end up, sending their information and data to us to feed into the process that we've laid out for how we're going to do all of this. Beyond that, I have not had either the time or the bandwidth to do, and that's why I would look to NASA to expand the scientific and academic relationships that they have across all of our allies and partners on how can we bring them into the fold. That's where I think there's a lot of benefit to NASA taking lead on that.
Great. Thank you. But one just clarifications for people who don't know, what are the Five Eyes?
Oh, I'm sorry. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Five Eyes, those are that's the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. So those are the 5 partners.
Terrific. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So our next presentation is from Mike Free from the FAA, talking about the FAA's role and what's learned.
Would like to thank the panel for the opportunity to come and give an overview of the FAA and some data points around the FAA's mission, the data the FAA provides to provide the framing of what are the surveillance systems that we can bring to bear, or there's data around those sensors, as well as to frame the limitations of those. Sean talked about some of the data points that are used and being integrated. So hopefully this will give you an overview of the FAA's mission, as well as those data points. Next slide, please. So the FAA's mission is quite large and complex. By a factor of 2, we operate more commercial aircraft than any other country. I think we're second only to Australia in total airspace, but largely because Australia has a very large oceanic volume that they're responsible for managing. So it is a very complex, very large national airspace system. We have over 14,000 controllers, 520 air traffic control towers, which are located at the highest density of airports, and I'll refer to those as towers in subsequent slides. We have 147 what we call terminal radar approach controls, or TRACONs, and those are manned control facilities at the high and medium density airports around the nation, as well as 21 air route traffic control centers, which manage the control of air traffic in the en route environment. There's over 19,000 airports, over 5,000 of those are associated public airports, with the remaining 14,000 plus private airports. Next slide, please. So the FAA's mission is primarily around safe and efficient control of manned aircraft. That has been our historical mission, and it remains our primary mission. Certainly as we talk about new entrants with UASs and advanced air mobility and some of those things, there will be an evolution of the FAA's mission to include safe operation of the NAS with those new entrants. But the architecture and design of the NAS is geared around safe and efficient control of aircraft and manned aircraft. Certainly the commercial aspect, the commercial flights are a primary focus of the agency. We certainly support general aviation and flights as well. But again, our mission is around manned aircraft and safe and efficient operation of those. By the numbers, over 16 million flights yearly, 5,400 flights at peak at the peak time of any given day, 45,000 daily flights, 25 million GA flight hours per year. A very large, very complex operation that we're responsible for managing. We certainly provide a significant contribution for that service to the nation in the form of product toward a GDP. Next slide. So as we get into the discussion of surveillance services, I want to provide a little bit of framework around the categorization of our surveillance services, and we primarily break those into two bodies. The cooperative surveillance, which is defined by a sensor that's avionics or equipment on board the aircraft that works in conjunction with ground-based sensors. The non-cooperative surveillance is independent. This is basically the classic radar. RF energy is transmitted out, reflects off the target, and we receive that signal, and from that return we can determine where that aircraft is. Typically, these cooperative and non-cooperative sensors are co-located together. The cooperative mounted on top of the non-cooperative radar. So from a data perspective, I think in this panel, in the study, I think that the cooperative sensors, those are neither unknown or anomalous. So for the purposes of this briefing or the rest of this briefing, I'm going to focus on the non-cooperative aspect. Next slide, please. So again, from a standpoint of the mission of the FAA, is primarily around manned aircraft, and I think that serves as an important framework for the data points and the type of data that we can bring to bear for this panel. So we break our systems and the design of the systems into different types of systems. So we have short-range radars, which are typically located at the high and medium density airports. And those operate from a range. They have a detection range of between 40 and 60 miles and an altitude detection capability of about 24,000 feet. The long-range radar systems have a detection range of 2 to 250 nautical miles with altitude detection up to 100,000 feet. So that provides the basic the framework for those. I will mention the Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, or ADS-B. only from a context that that does serve as a primary data source and a preferred data source for the management of the airspace system, but it is a cooperative system, and for the purposes of the next slides as I get into the discussion of the coverage and the type of detection for those non-cooperative targets, it is not considered as part of those. And also surface surveillance is also something that we provide, but again, for the purpose of the study, I only include those for just a completeness perspective. The one final point, as I talk about manned aircraft and primary mission for the drones and balloons and things of that nature, their basic premise is to operate in a not to interfere basis, that they are not to interfere with manned operations, and that's a fundamental aspect as we talk to the data and what we can and can't detect with respect to those non-manned systems. Next slide, please. Realizing this is an eye chart, I would wanted to provide just a graphical or pictorial depiction of where our sensors are located. The green, blue, and pink balloons, if you will, represent our short-range radars. Those are located at airports. Those are where those are sited. The two reddish balloons, they have letters in them, a 4 and a C. Those represent our long-range radars, the AARO 4s and CARSR systems that are used in the context of both from an air traffic control perspective as well as for a national defense and homeland security mission. And the perimeter, the AARO 4s are located around the perimeter of the country, equally spaced, and the CARSR systems are located on the interior of the U.S. I will point out that this only depicts the CONUS. There are systems, ATC, both short-range and long-range systems, Hawaii, Alaska, and Caribbean. Those are not depicted here. I didn't think they were necessary for the purpose of understanding the surveillance. And I will also point out that both for this slide and the subsequent coverage slide, I do not talk to any classified DoD or DHA systems that are in operation. Okay, next slide, please. So what can the FAA detect and surveil, what can we not? This slide gives you a by altitude slice of what it is that we can detect. So if you look at the square that's labeled 1,000-foot AGL, that depicts by sensor for an aircraft that is 1,000 feet in altitude, what is the range at which we can detect that aircraft? And so on, as you get higher in altitude, or higher in altitude, you can detect it at further range. And that's basically a phenomenon of the curvature of the Earth and the line of sight aspect of these radar systems. So pretty good coverage across the U.S. at 10,000 feet and above. This is a mathematical model based of a pure line of sight as well as some geographical screening. As you can see in the western part of the U.S., there is screening due to the mountains and those sensors. Need to take a little bit of time and talk about the nature of the targets. These line of sight models represent an input of a target that is 1 square meter. So think of a sphere of 1 meter in diameter. That's the assumption that goes into these models. So if you think about that in the context of other forms or aircraft, a 4th generation F-15 or F-18 is in the proximity of about 1 square meter, perhaps a little bit larger. A large airliner is perhaps 100 square meters. A small UAS is perhaps a 0.01 square meter. So the range of these detections or the size and the ability to detect these targets from an F-15, large airliner, 100 times larger in size, a drone 100 times smaller in size. So the detection and the surveillance capability really largely depends in part to the target that we're talking about and the ability to surveil that target. All right, next slide. So I do include this ADS-B coverage slide just to give a context of, from a cooperative perspective, there is very good coverage across the U.S. to 1,500 feet above ground level. So this provides a context of when we look at the data and start getting a discussion of what it is we can detect. This will certainly be, for those cooperative aircraft that have ADS-B, we could certainly detect those to a pretty low altitude across the U.S. All right, a couple of data points. I think I know Sean certainly talked about some of the data points, and I can provide a little bit of insight from an FAA perspective. Drones are a pretty significant challenge. There's 880,000 registered drones in the U.S. Small drones, I should say, Part 107 drones. Many tens of thousands of those are operated on a daily basis by commercial operators. It's not clear how many private drone operators are taking their drone up for a quick flight. But as I said earlier, those are regulated they're regulated to operate below 400 feet in altitude. So again, it's the drone aspect is for those small drones in particular, and as well as all classes of drones. There are regulatory restrictions to where they can and cannot fly, basically avoiding and not interfering with manned aircraft operations. Second data point, we talked about balloons. The Weather Service, we know on 92 weather stations that release balloons twice a day. At 6 a.m. or 0000 Zulu and 1200 Zulu. Typically 2-hour duration. They fly up to 100,000 feet where the envelope bursts and then the payload descends back to Earth. So certainly, at least 184 balloon flights daily in the NAS. Not to consider universities and hobbyist balloons that may be launched, but those are typically small in size. And finally, Sean did talk about UAPs and FAA data. A couple of data points that we do report. There is a process by which air traffic controllers can report UAP sightings or events. Historically, those have been in the range of about 3 to 5 reports per month that have been reported. We did see an uptick of reports in August of 22 that went up to about 8 to 10, perhaps due to Starlink launches. And finally, with the Chinese weather or the Chinese balloon incident in February, we did see a significant uptick, and there's like 68 UAP reports that started in February, and we've seen a large number, subsequent to that. I think that's all I had. Any questions?
Do you want to take the question? It's easy. Actually, you can choose the questioners. It's easier from your angle than from mine.
All right, Walter.
Yeah, so two questions about the radar data coverage. First one is, do you retain any of the data, or is it just cycled over as?
There is a retention, long-term retention of data. I can't recall exactly how long retain that. There's certainly a requirement from a retention from a legal perspective. Yeah, exactly. But I do know there is some periodicity measured in a term of months.
Is it retained in terms of like the raw radar, or is some processed form of data that's retained?
I believe it's a processed form of data that is what was displayed on the, whether it's an en route ERAM system or the STAR system.
And then the other question is for the radars, are they operated in any sort of a tasked mode, or are they constant search mode?
The current systems in our inventory, they're fixed face, and they just rotate at either 12 RPM or 5 RPM, depending on whether it's an en route or a terminal surveillance requirement. All right, next question. Yes.
Mike, forgive me if you mentioned this earlier. You said, I think you said 3 to 5 reports per month.
Per month.
Out of how many?
That is 3 to 5 reports per month for all of the controllers in all of the U.S. So there's a process by which if they see something and they want to report that, they can go to report that to the den, we call it, but report, hey, I saw something, I don't know what it was. So that's 3 to 5 per month across the entire 14,000 controllers per month. So, 45,000 operations any given day, 30 days, however many days in a month, it's a very small percentage.
Can you describe actually about this? How do you encourage to report? Do you feel like the stigma on UAPs is impairing the reporting? Do you feel the reporting is biased?
I'm not aware well, I'll answer it this way. The process by which UAP is reported is part of the air traffic controller order. So basically, the air traffic controllers are allowed. It says, if you see something, here's a process by which the procedure by which you would report it. Other than that, I'm not aware of any specific stigma or limitations, and I'm probably not in a good position to speak to that. Other than there is that process, and that is the process that we use, and is what represents those numbers I talked to.
And if I may have, I had a question prior to this one. How do you decide the sites where you deploy? You saw the map, and it has some very good coverage on the coastal areas. There were some areas of lack of coverage.
Yeah. So if you go back one slide from what's presented here, what you'll see is in the eastern half of the U.S. there's a lot better coverage, but that's because there's a lot more population in the east, and therefore a lot more airports. And these systems are historically sited at the airports in support of those airport operations. To the west, obviously, to less dense and fewer systems. Now, that's from an ASR, the short-range radar perspective. The long-range radars are pretty much equally spaced in order to provide the maximum coverage from a homeland defense and security perspective, as well as with higher altitude flights, the en route cruise phase of air traffic control. Warren.
Mike, first, thank you and the FAA for coming to share this information with us. Second, can you speak to a little bit of the filtering techniques that we use? So with respect to, I know Walter had a question about the raw data and process, but can you just talk a little bit about, we actually aren't trying to detect everything.
That's actually a very good question and a very good point with respect to what we can and cannot see. So there are, the closer to the ground you point a radar, certainly you can get lower elevations, but you also start to see the effects of trees and other ground-based clutter, as we call it, that starts to interfere. So we have great ability to detect a lot of things, but from an FAA mission perspective, our desire is to find that sweet spot of seeing everything to as low an altitude as we can to maximize our mission around safe operations of manned aircraft. Now, to pull that thread just a little bit further, there's also limitations with respect to biologicals or insects and dust and things of this flavor that most aircraft fly above a certain speed. So we typically will have filtering settings on our systems to get rid of the stuff that really is leaves or insects or things of that nature, so that we provide as clean a display for the controllers. So there are specific settings that we can adjust, and it's been learned over many years to perfect those, what we call optimization of those kinds of filters, to get rid of what is not a manned aircraft, not an aircraft, and provide as clean a display for the controllers as we can. Yes? Yeah, please.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Would it be, kind of following up on what you said, Warren, would it be possible to collect the raw data and to save that? Because if it would be possible to do some calibration after the fact that Sean was mentioning, for example, you might be able to capture other phenomenology. Is that possible?
Well, when you say raw data, I think we'd have to talk a little bit about what is meant. So, from a technical perspective, pure, what we would call INQ data is huge, gigabyte, very, very, very large volumes of data. That would probably be cost prohibitive, and we certainly don't do that today. There are, again, we do record data, but it is effectively the data that has been through some form of these processings and these filterings. We do that today, but it certainly, with enough time and money, we could certainly collect that data, and I think it would be a we'd have to look at the challenge of how we would go about modifying the systems or introducing new ways to collect that raw data as you described. Certainly it's feasible, it's possible, but it's not without technical challenge.
One quick question on the
Yes.
184 balloon flights daily. Are those characterized, or you just know they do that and then they just end up where they are?
So under the balloon, I'll call it Part 101, the regulations for balloons, there's very specific requirements. So for National Weather Service, before they release those, they'll contact the local air traffic facility. They're going to say, here's what time I'm going to release it. And when they release it, they have tracking, and they provide that tracking to the air traffic control facility throughout the flight of that particular balloon. There are commercial balloons that are also launched, but those for the most part, as I understand it, they actually transmit their GPS position in support of where they're flying, so as to ensure they're not interfering with air traffic, and to ensure the air traffic controllers are aware of where those balloons are operating. Yes, ma'am.
So we've talked about reporting the 3 to 5 per month from air traffic control, but what about from the non-cooperative surveillance? Has there been anomalies from the sensors themselves? And if so, what is the process for that?
I'd say the FAA mission is not around anomalies with the non-cooperative sensors themselves. So as we build an air traffic control picture, we have both the non-cooperative systems, which detects the target. We have a cooperative system that also detects a target, and we will tend to merge those targets together. And so on a controller's display, they'll know, is this a non-cooperative only or a merged or combined target, so that they know, basically an increased level of confidence that on what it is they're seeing is in fact a real aircraft. So we don't make any real distinction between a non-cooperative and a cooperative, other than how they get combined and put on a controller's display. So I don't know if that answered your.
An unregistered flight?
So like a GA flight that is flying visual flight rules, those will just be picked up by if they're not equipped with a cooperative avionics, those would just be picked up by the non-cooperative system that if they happen to surveil where that aircraft is flying. And so that certainly will be put on the controller's display, and they will be able to provide awareness. In fact, there's a flight following procedure by which GA pilots can ask for, hey, I'm not squawking, or I don't have a cooperative system, but please help me, and just via the radio, I'm going to go on from here to here and providing awareness, situational awareness, if the controller has the bandwidth to provide that data.
One last question.
Yes.
So I'm not a scientist, I'm a recovering attorney, and I love process. And a few questions there. If I'm a pilot, where do I find that process for reporting UAPs? Where is that articulated or captured? Second, when you mentioned that you're reporting these incidents, who are you reporting it to? And are those incidents, pulling on the thread that Reggie started, are they being archived anywhere?
I believe they are archived. They're reported to the domestic network, event network. It's an FAA organization or function. I can't speak to whether they would be, say, part of what Sean would include as part of his database. I presume so. So I think that was the answer to the second question. What was the first question again? I'm sorry.
Where does the reporting process live? If I'm a pilot, I see a UAP, where do I go to find out?
I don't know the answer to that question. Like I said, I'm familiar with the reporting process from a controller perspective and the order that's used to define how controllers do their job. I don't know the answer to the question from a pilot perspective.
Gotcha.
Great. So thank you, Mike, for your presentation and for all the help the FAA has given us as we've been learning more about the very impressive system that the FAA maintains.
Thank you.
I know.
Thank you for having me.
For me, one of the many takeaways from this is feeling, just a little bit safer every time I fly, and thankful for you and your colleagues for what they do to make that possible.
Thank you.
And we're now going to take a quick lunch break. We'll be back at 12:30. And see you all soon. series of short presentations by members of the panel on their thoughts on different aspects of our charge. And the format is we're going to have them come up to the podium and speak. And I'm going to ask each of the speakers then to take questions. It's actually the angle with this setup is you can see the people better from the podium than I can, where it's hard to see people behind you. I'm going to try to manage the time. So as those questions come to an end, I'll cut you off and bring up the next speaker. And we'll move through the 6 topics, and then we'll have some time at the end for some general discussion. The first speaker will be Dr. Nadia Drake, talking about framing the issue of UAP.
Hello, and welcome back from lunch, everybody, and a welcome to those of you watching us virtually. I'm Nadia. I am a scientist by training. I'm also a science journalist now, and my job is to try and synthesize the information that we've learned so far and summarize the situation. So if you will, put together a framework for thinking about UAP. Now I'm going to try and do this in a way that reflects the thoughts of the entire panel, although obviously we have a variety of opinions and ideas among us. So I'd like to leave some time at the end for you to weigh in with disagreements or concurrences as needed. So first, a housekeeping matter. The definition of UAP changed during the 7 months of our fact-finding process. UAP initially stood for unidentified aerial phenomena, with aerial referring to events occurring in Earth's atmosphere. That A is now defined as anomalous, which includes the space, air, and undersea domains. As a panel, I think we have decided to continue focusing our recommendations on the aerial domain, because that is where the majority of sightings and events have occurred, and also because we couldn't fully pivot to address the expanded scope of the new acronym. Beyond that, there are 3 points I want to make. The first is that for a number of reasons, UAP are obviously quite interesting, right? That is why we are here. Recently, many credible witnesses have reported seeing unidentified objects in the sky, some of which are behaving rather peculiarly. In some instances, these reports include corroborating data from various instruments, various sensors. The challenge that we have is that the data needed to explain these anomalous sightings often do not exist or are incomplete for generating a conclusive analysis. This includes eyewitness reports, which on their own can be interesting and compelling, but often lack the information needed to make definitive conclusions about an object's provenance. We as a panel are thinking about the types of data that might add value to those reports and which could be useful on their own. As a corollary, to date, in the refereed scientific literature, there is no conclusive evidence suggesting an extraterrestrial origin for UAP. Collecting more good data for the scientific community to review in a peer-reviewed context will be important for progress to be made here. The second point, UAP offer an excellent opportunity to demonstrate the power of the scientific method and of empirically addressing a question using a multidisciplinary approach. It is our job as a panel to make some recommendations about how NASA might go about tackling this topic scientifically, taking advantage of the agency's resources, global outreach, and reputation. Key points to keep in mind here are that science is hypothesis-driven. Scientists build confidence in their theories by relying on well-calibrated, well-collected data, using well-established methods with rigorous evaluation and independent corroboration. In science, skepticism is not a bias, nor is it a bad word. It is not our job to define nature, but to study it in ways that let nature reveal itself to us, regardless of how exciting or disappointing that reality might be. And to that end, when we're thinking about making recommendations about how NASA can tackle this topic scientifically, I think it's important to remember that it's not NASA's job to replicate the efforts of the Department of Defense, but rather to consider approaches that are complementary to what the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office is doing. And so one of the questions that we as a panel, I think, need to center is, what can we recommend that NASA can do that the DoD cannot? Third point, to that end, what are we even looking for? How are we defining this problem? And how do the available data define what seems to be, to borrow a cliche, a very slender needle in a very big haystack? We heard a little bit about that today from Dr. Kirkpatrick, who reported that there have been 800 events collected over about 27 years. And between 2 and 5% of those events display signatures that could be anomalous, defined as anything that is not readily understandable by the operator or the sensor, something that is doing something weird. Mr. Free and some of the experts on our panel have defined the background on which those events exist, the amount of stuff in the sky at any given time, like so. On average, FAA air traffic control handles 45,000 flights per day in US airspace, with 5,400 aircraft in the sky at peak time. Worldwide, on average, there are about 1,600 weather balloon launches per day. In the US, there are at least 184 of those balloons launched, and that doesn't include private companies or research flights. There are about 1.69 million recreational or model small uncrewed aircraft systems, and an additional 880,000 drones are registered for commercial use. And these are not controlled by air traffic control, and they are not scheduled flights. So that's our challenge. So when making recommendations as a panel, I think we need to look at what kind of imprint we want to leave. What does the situation look like 5 years from now? What does it look like 10 years from now? Why are we making these recommendations? We heard a little bit about this morning from both Mike and David, who noted that many discoveries in science are rooted in initially unexplained and bizarre phenomena. So by carefully scrutinizing the sky, or however we end up defining our search space, and by collaborating across disciplines, we are likely to learn new things about our planet. That's a fact. And that's the commensal science case we might want to consider when making recommendations here. All right. Does anyone have thoughts?
Questions, thoughts, comments?
Carlin.
I guess I want to challenge a little bit. We changed the A from aerial to anomalous as the legislation required, but I'm not sure we precluded anything beyond the aerial for this panel, and so I've just raised that as a question for us, even though mostly what we've seen, and I think NASA's mission space would be more the aerial.
I agree with you, and I think that is a parameter that we need to define as a panel.
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump in and echo some remarks I made this morning, that yes, the A changed from aerial to anomalous, but it's also accurate to say that the preponderance of events are in the aerial domain. That being said, your panel scope has expanded outwards, and I think we'll hear a little bit from David later on that very subject.
I mean, I think anomalous, people often think about it as going down, and including ocean. But I think what's very relevant for NASA is going out, right? And, looking at things in our solar system. And I think in some sense, I think there's certain responsibilities in, when we look at airspace, there's FAA responsibilities, there's DoD responsibilities. As you get further and further away from the Earth, eventually it's all NASA. Once you get out, towards certainly much of the solar system and out to our galaxy, that's all NASA. And when we start, thinking about things like, and this will be, David will get to this, observations beyond the Earth's atmosphere. I think this change in language lets us also think about outward, further out in the solar system as well.
Good, yeah.
Other thoughts? Great.
Did I summarize everything totally accurately? Awesome.
Excellent.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Paula.
All right, thank you. So I thought that was the perfect intro and segue by Dr. Drake for addressing why NASA. What is or what are NASA's roles in UAP studies? So NASA primarily is a science-driven agency. It's committed to exploring and understanding air and space. And this includes, as we were just discussing, the unknown, right? Whether that's the farthest reaches of the universe or right here on our home planet. In that light, NASA has over 60 years of experience measuring phenomena in air and space, in air that might be aeronautics, astronomy, as well as measuring other Earth phenomena, and this may include aquatic or atmospheric phenomena as well. And they do this using the unique vantage point of space. NASA's mission, data, and technical expertise in science and engineering may also help investigate and understand any of the reported phenomena. It makes sense to explore what new observations or measurements or studies might contribute to the understanding of reported phenomena. In that light, Dr. Fox made this point this morning, there's a tremendous archive of NASA data. These are from satellites and other space-based and ground networks, as well as other assets, and these are freely and openly available to the public. NASA research, as was mentioned, also supports a wide range of methods. This includes advanced data analysis, modeling, cutting-edge computational and data visualization tools, and these are all useful for investigating unexplained observations, which may be crucial in studying these phenomena. Discoveries and results are all publicly available. And this can be something from the characterization of extraterrestrial solar planets or the hole in the ozone layer. And these are communicated publicly through many outlets through the agency. NASA also has a long-standing public trust. This is essential to communicate those findings about phenomena to the public and, as was mentioned several times, very important, to destigmatize the reporting and raise awareness of cultural and social barriers to doing so. NASA has a unique strength in leveraging public and private partnerships that could result in new technologies that may be useful in observing and understanding reported phenomena. These partners could include other federal agencies. We've heard from the FAA today, as well as NOAA was identified. And they may collect data that could help to understand reported phenomena. In addition, NASA has a strong record of international collaboration, which could be beneficial to study any of these phenomena, as that may require global cooperation and data sharing. And then one thing that really strikes me is that new understanding of anomalous events really comes from when we bring communities together, interdisciplinary communities that would not necessarily collaborate. And in my world, that might be biological and physical oceanographers, and I tell people to think a little more broadly. What if we brought together astronomers and earth scientists like we did on this panel? So those interdisciplinary research teams, as well as citizen scientists, could explore historical and current NASA and partner data for events, or more importantly, for environmental conditions around the time of reported events. And this may help in our understanding. And then finally, given NASA's experience with long-term missions, long-term projects, and scientific focus, the agency is really well equipped to handle the extensive and ongoing study of phenomena investigation that this likely requires. So hopefully that gave you some thoughts as to why NASA. I don't know if any of my fellow panelists agree or disagree. Discuss. Yes.
Paula, thank you. So NASA has a great visibility in the community, and UAPs are obviously of great interest to a very diverse range of people. So can you speak a bit about the opportunity that this provides for NASA to expand, the knowledge of the understanding of the scientific method?
Yes. So it's a great question. There are multiple opportunities I think UAP present. The first, as I mentioned, I think is to bring together interdisciplinary research teams and scientists and citizen scientists to really take a look at, with an objective and perhaps unique eye, what the NASA Data Archive actually means. Blend in the partnerships, a renewed partnership that's at the federal, the international, and the private level, right? So I think there are any number of pathways that people could pursue that could be really advantageous for helping us to understand what's happening with any reported UAP. Questions?
Thank you, Paula. This is Jelly Wright. Actually, my question and comment actually goes to both you and Nadia. Dr. Kirkpatrick gave us a definition of anomalous that it was not readily understandable to the operator or the sensor. And from the NASA's perspective, for our panel, I think we have to consider a broader definition if we're talking about citizen science. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious of how we incorporate that, especially within the communication avenues that we were just discussing.
It's a good question. So